Welcome to our second lesson. This is kind of an interesting painting because what we're going to do is we're going to paint this in grisaille, which means values of gray, and then we will come back and add different colors on top. But one thing, especially when you're working with a background this dark, you have to realize is that you have to paint quite dark. You can't let your eye be fooled when you look at the photo and say, oh, well, it's probably a lot lighter than the mixes say. So just keep that in mind as you're working. And we are going to make, I'm starting down on the center on this petal that's at about 1 o'clock, and I'm going to make the center pretty dark so that when we put it on the actual poppy center, we'll have something to nestle it down into. Remember with flowers that just about anything that you do, it's going to be curved. So notice this first dark has that nice curve to it. And now I'm switching to warm white with that dot of yellow in it. And what this is going to do is give us a place, if you look at the final photo, this will give us a place to put a really nice yellow glow. And so it might not have anything to do with the creation of the flower, of the form, but it has a lot to do with coming back in and knowing that we have to put in some natural coloration. So a lot of blending in this area, and it might look a little odd, a little stripy until we come back and have everything on top. Okay, I'm going to switch back now to a little bit lighter dark, moving up. Again, my idea is that I really want to make sure that everything is curving. So I'm watching that this dark curves this way, that as I blend this next value in, it's curving. And this is how you can make your flowers look very fragile. If you keep everything really hard and straight, then you'll end up with kind of hard looking flowers, and nobody wants that. So still working with the high dark, which is the dark that's below the medium. We go back to a darker value. And I'm just following the diagram on page 14. Now I'm going to pick up my medium value. I'm going to place the medium value. And I'm using a fairly large brush because this is, in my opinion, a pretty big petal. So I've got a 12 in my hand, but if you're comfortable, you can, if you're uncomfortable with that big of a brush, you can drop down. There's the medium value. Wipe my brush and blend. And at this point I'm keeping my brush still half on one value, half on the other. Short pulling Xy strokes. Now looking at that diagram, you can see where it's getting lighter. So I am dropping to a smaller brush. Because what we have is we have this really nice area here that's lifting up to meet the light. And so we're going to make that a light area. With flowers, you want to have interesting outside edges. No flat areas. No exaggerated curves, just minor ins and outs. Now I'm taking everything. We have a pivot point on this flower. Pivot point is where the flower grew from. So what I'm doing now is I'm going to take what I have finished and do or blocked in, I guess, really, and just do a directional mop. And you can do this with an actual mop also. But what I'm doing is I'm just pulling this all in down toward that pivot point, and that's going to give everything that little bit of a flow. Coming back in and making that section just a little bit lighter. There's another area that's coming in from the outside edge. It's another great place to get a little bit lighter. We do have this small section here that is part of this petal, and what you'll notice, I like to do a petal at a time. In other words, I don't like to jump around and put in all my medium and then all of my dark. I like to just do one section, and then when I'm satisfied with that section, move on to another. Plus flowers, and this one isn't as complicated as, say, a rose, but a lot of times flowers just, you get lost in the petals if you do a lot of jumping around. So as I was talking, I put a little bit of light on that outside edge. And I didn't line it, and again, I want minor ins and outs. And I'm pulling this all in toward the pivot point. I think this flower already is getting some nice streaks and ruffles to it. We do have a little turned back area here, and what you can do, notice I painted over it. I'm going to come back in now, and I have light on my brush. I'm just finding that little bit of a turn back, and then I put light, and then I'm going to come in with a shadowy dark, even going down to some of the darkest darks. And because our light's coming from the upper right, I'll have a little bit here, but the vast majority of that dark will be on the lower left side, because we have the upper right light source. But see how easy that is to drop a flip in, because you already have the underneath structure created. Because I had it on my brush, I'm adding a little bit more dark on either side of that ripple, and see how that's popping that forward just a little bit more. Let's do this cupped section here. Starting off with medium value. And this brush might be a tiny bit too big for the space, but that's when I just use a portion of the brush. In the final photo, you'll see, like I said before, lots of color, but we're not worried about that. We are just worried about creating structure. So there is my medium value. Now I'm going to go to dark. And this is a crescent shape on the bottom, so I'm just trying to consciously have a curve at the bottom to roll that under, and now getting darker yet. And pretty much just as diagrammed. To create some ripples, you can put some dark on the outside edge where it bumps out. That'll create that outside ripple. You have that little bit of a turn back again. You can start with the dark if you care to. You don't have to start with the light. Just add some dark on the underneath. And that'll roll that back. There could be stronger dark. Anytime you see a dark and it forms a point, that's where it can definitely be much darker. I made this little section darker. Now I'm thinking, oh, I can make this little section darker as well. So there's 2 petals. Let's continue our way around and do this large petal over on the left. Coming in with, again, a fair amount of dark down at the center, with the idea of being able to, and I wish I hadn't, I transferred on the center. That doesn't even make any sense. Don't transfer that on, because you just paint over it. Sometimes I think, if you transfer something on, you think, well, I better, paint around it, because I took all that effort to draw that circle. Now going in with warm white. That idea, just the same as over in here, that we want to have that area for that yellow glaze, and if we don't leave that fairly warm, what's going to happen is, or fairly light, is we won't be able to put anything in that area, just go to a kind of a murky green. And now shifting over to the high dark. And my suggestion would definitely be to paint over those turn back areas. So there's the high dark, taking that all the way to the edge. This edge can be somewhat straight because it's actually the outside edge of the turn back. You'll see what I mean in just a minute. Grab my smaller brush from behind my ear, and I think first what I'm going to do is concentrate just a little bit on the rippling of those outside edges. So again, just kind of let your eye follow the outside edges and look for areas that are bumping out and curving in. So this is a curving in area. So that's a really great place for a ripple, a light ripple. Just like over in here, this is our best example because it's so exaggerated. So there's a couple of areas, and again, knowing where that pivot point is, because that's going to be important, because you're going to take and tickle those edges down toward that pivot point. And you can give everything kind of that directional mop, either with an actual mop or brush. These edges are running together a little bit, so I'm going to lighten that up. Hit that light area again. This is where we're going to have that turn back, so since I still have all that light on my brush, I'll get that going as well. Now I have the dark on my brush. I'm going to roll that back edge back and strengthen the dark underneath the turn back. A little stronger in that corner now. Even though this is a white flower bordering on pink later, don't be afraid to come back in with maybe even a brush mix of black if things need to be stronger. And that's what that needed in that area. And you could always, of course, come back and strengthen it later, but the upside about doing it now is a couple of things. One, it's done, and the other is it just blends so easily. Sometimes when you glaze it on or dry brush it on later, it just doesn't blend as easily. So that, I think for now, is this particular petal. Except, of course, for this. And if you want to lift up a petal, like I just did, don't be consistent with the line. Put down a little bit of dark and then ease it out. Keep it crisp on one side and don't make it exactly the same all the way across. Let's go ahead and do this very interesting outside petal. Let's do this little section first. Fair amount of dark. To roll that back and then, or tuck it under, and then a fair amount of dark here to give this a roll. Just can't let these sections go. And now as diagrammed, it goes from dark to medium to light to medium to dark. And the idea is that this is actually a cylinder shape, and so with that in mind, what you have to do is create the cylinder shape, which is dark on the outside edges and light and medium through the center. I put dark on that back edge. Now I'm going to come through with medium. And then I'll do some highlighting and strengthening of the dark. Now coming through with the light, and always try your light, and if your light isn't light enough, then pick up warm white. This is such a friendly value scale because, it's just grays. So you're not going to get mud if you skip around a little bit. Not a good habit to get into because sometimes it does create mud. on this side, still have that little bit of light on my brush, well, not enough to matter. On this side, again, it's doing a little bit of a twist and a turn. I like to go from the known to the unknown, and so I know that this is light. Got a little bit of light here. Now I'm going to drop down to a mid value. I'm at this moment using a flat, but you could use a flat or a filbert for this. Now to help roll this under, getting fairly dark. Light in through here to give it form, and also that idea of the ruffle. Some light in through here, and then a little bit across the top to show the thickness section. And the same here, and you could do this with a liner, you know, if you'd want to. See how this running line is what helps establish the twists and turns of that section. And mine disappeared in some areas, so I'll go back with some dark, or plan on hitting it with a liner also. If you're a fan of painting cloth, this is the same idea. If you're having a lot of luck with this and you thought you could never paint cloth, well, this is just exactly the same as painting cloth. So painting flowers really does translate to other things. Pretty much the last thing that we need to do is fill in this center again, so that we have a dark area to nestle our poppy center into. If you painted around it, or if you transferred it on and painted around it, you just really need to paint over it. It's really for the best. All right, that is that first poppy. The back poppy, I think that I'm going to let you do that on your own, just because there is really, aside from, you know, just dropping on the flowers or the petals following the placement guide, there is not a lot new there. Strive for the interesting outside edges. Make sure that the darks that you place on curve. Come back and pull everything in toward that pivot point. And then we will move on to cherries. There's lots of different cherries on here, but as you can imagine, they're all done exactly the same way, so I'll do this big one. We want our cherries to just, they're not main players, they're there to fill, but what we want is them to just emerge out of the background. So I'm putting in a crescent of dark, and this is that same sphere shape that we had on our cantaloupe. And so there's the dark sphere. Medium through the center. Of course, blending as we go. And then the light in the upper 1/4. And you're not going for that high shine yet, you're still just creating form, because we'll put that high shine on when it's applicable. So that is how each and every cherry is going to be painted. Go ahead and put in all of the cherries, big ones, small ones, and then we will concentrate on leaves. We have two different kinds of leaves because we have two different kinds of objects. One is, of course, poppy leaves, and then the other are some cherry leaves. The poppy leaves we're going to make those just a little bit warmer, meaning just a little bit of burnt umber in the darker mixes and a little bit of raw sienna in the lighter mixes. And this will just definitely give it a little bit of some variety, because we have variety in shape, but then this will also give us some variety in color and in temperature. These are not the star players, as you can tell. Our poppies are the star players, so these are going to be about the same value, different color of course, but about the same value as the background. And what we'll mainly see on these are just the light catching the edges. So I'm coming in with the dark green and filling in. And like I said, you can brush mix in some of the browns and burnt umbers into the mix. You can brush mix browns and burnt umbers into this mix for variety, because like I said, initially we're just going to base this in with the dark value. I have not dried this yet, that's why I'm being kind of cautious around the poppy. I'm going to come back in with now lighter values, and using the same rippling ideas that we learned from before. I'm trying to create a ripple by making an area that comes out from the inside edge, I guess, or in. So if it's in, it's light. If it bumps out into our space, it's dark. I'm just, again, just finding some edges. You can conversely do this with the dark and make some darker sections. This is obviously not a leaf study. We'll do a pretty pretty good leaf study when we get to the autumn leaves painting. We also have an entire video dedicated to leaves. But these leaves again are space fillers. They're dark. They're going to act as a complement to our reds that we're going to put in. And as you can see, I found some of the edges with light. I didn't outline them. And I definitely want to have, I'm going to come in with quite a dark value down in this area, just to be sure to tuck this back behind. One thing that you want to watch is again that you have curves. So if you're going to make this a dark area, have it a curve. Don't just outline and follow the petal on top. I think I'm going to catch an edge again. Also trying to cover up my graphite lines. It's interesting with graphite lines, you want them apparent enough so that you can see what you're doing, but not so apparent that you can't cover them later, so it's a strange little balancing act with that. Leaves, of course, also have a pivot point, and the pivot point is always from which point the object grew, and so I'm pulling down toward the pivot point, and it's always either the middle of a flower or on a leaf, the stem area. That is how those two leaves will be done. There's two poppy leaves, well actually three. There's one on the lower right section. Then we have some more traditional leaves, and let's do a traditional leaf together. I'm going to start off by putting a crescent of dark on the underneath. A little bit of a dark gully up the middle, a little valley for the indentation, filling the rest in with the mid value. And this is how you'll do all these little leaves. Still seeing graphite lines. That's how you'll do all of the little leaves that are scattered throughout. A little bit of a blend. Now I'm going to come back in with my light value and chisel in, trying to avoid the dark area. So in other words, this chiseling that I'm doing, aiming down toward that pivot point and trying to stay within the medium value. Coming back now at the corner of my brush and just blending that down in. In general, to give a leaf a look like it's twisting and turning in space, you want to have one section a little bit lighter than the other. So I'm going to find that edge on this side. And now it appears that the leaf has just a little bit of a variety. This side's a little bit lighter. Again, that's how you'll do all of these twisty turny sections. And obviously on this short 1 hour video, I can't paint every inch of this for you, but I'm showing you everything that's new. And another section that's a little bit new is these tendrils. Now one thing that you want to do, your tendril can come out, wherever you need it to come out, but what you, I would say never want to do, I guess, is have it, see how there's this deep V? You do not want to have a tendril coming out of a deep V. Just considered poor art form. It ends up making it look like an arrow. So I'm base coating the tendril with burnt umber. And if you prefer, you could use a a liner brush, shading the underneath with black, irregular but neat outside edges. I got a little bit on my flower right here. I have to fix it. And now coming through the center with anything light on your palette, a light green, a light red, anything, and going through the center in an irregular way, adding in light values. And coming back and blending it down just a little bit. And that's how each tendril will be done. So now we have our tendrils, or branches I guess, two different kinds of leaves and cherries. I haven't dried this yet. For the next step, it really does need to be dry because we're going to add in the centers and all of the beautiful color. Our next step is to add the characteristic markings that I talked about early on. And this is where you really have to think about the growth direction of this particular flower. And of course, it's all going to flow out of the center. So I have my brush loaded with crimson. And if depending on what you have underneath, it could look maybe too purple. And so if that's true, pick up a little bit of red with it. I just want to come in with a crimson. This is pretty solid, and like I said, you can see from the photo that this is just that characteristic coloring that's underneath. And so when you get to, here it's, just fill in the blank, but when you start going up the petals, then that's when you have to think about following the flow. Interesting how much that brightens that up completely. I barely have any paint on my brush at this moment, because what I'm doing What I'm doing is just adding a little bit of color to the bottom section. This is very subtle, darker, closer to where the two petals overlap, because that definitely helps with the form. Because this is being placed with purpose, so I'm looking for places where it's a dark area is where we want to place this. And on the outside edge of a petal, you want it to be darker on the outside. And then let it just flow and fade in. I'm using this big brush. You can certainly use a smaller brush, but what you probably don't want to do is do this with a liner. That just ends up looking a little liney, and you want it to look more like dark areas. I'm going to switch to a slightly smaller brush, And I'm going to take, anything that you do, you want it to have a value change, whether it's a ruffle or a accent, a shine. So I'm coming back in with the crimson plus a little bit of black. And if that looks too dull, you can pick up crimson plus a little bit of blue. I'm just placing this just on the outside edge, tickling it in to the first application of paint. Maybe some accents on the leaves also. But setting my brush down on that outside edge. I think that these gray grisaille flowers have really come to life. Find that edge. So just walk your brush around and look for a place to place an accent. An accent goes on the outside edge, and it's darker on that outside edge. And you look for an area that looks a little void of attention, and that's where you place an accent. You have your choice at this point. We need to add the very distinct poppy center. You can do that wet into wet if you wish, or you can dry this. I'm going to take a quick moment and dry, and then we'll add our poppy center. One thing that is just so beautiful on a flower is when the complements are next to each other. And you could have done this prior to the purple, but if it's dry, you can do it in this manner. But this is placed where we left the space with warm white. And this is just a glaze of color, and remember that a glaze is a transparent layer of paint placed over a dried underpainting. And it's just nature's way of attracting, I guess, bees to have these beautiful colors together. And if it, as it moves out of that warm white area, if it goes a little bit to the greenish side, that's okay. That is, I think that's just really adds to the flower. Now we can come in and place the actual center. Get with some crimson and black. You can transfer it on. You can eyeball it, which I'm doing. Just remember that it has to be elliptical in shape, because the center, of course, is, if we look straight down on it, would probably be a fairly good circle. But this angle that we're seeing this makes it elliptical, and so we're seeing a circle in perspective. Of course, never let a good brush load of paint go to waste. Just looking for a few places that this could be placed that would enhance our painting. picking up a small little detail brush, a 3/0. You can use any small pointing brush. I also like the 30/0 mini brush. But here's my pivot point. And because this is elliptical, the ones in the back will be shorter than the ones in the front. They're all triangular in shape. I'm going to blend the sides down in. You want the tip of this to be fairly apparent, and then the rest of it to just fade. I'm going to add some thickness to this with just a little bit of black plus crimson. Just adding through here. Just to look like there's some width to this. Then we have to add, there's pollen dots all the way around. First we need to draw out the pollen lines. This would probably be a good place to use some blue tint. There's also a few places diagrammed where we could place blue tint on our painting of our petals also. The ones in the front, again, just like the triangular shapes, the ones in the front will be longer just because of the perspective of it all. That's what we would see. And then the ones in the back, shorter. Blending these down just a bit. And now coming in with pollen dots. And you have to do this with a brush. I've had students saying, what can I do at the end of my stylus? Well, no, because doing it in this way you get a lot of variety. Because what happens is you set your brush down and the paint leaves, and so you end up with different values. Also, by twisting and turning your brush, you get different shapes and values. I feel like my center is floating a little bit. So I'm just going to come in, if it'll hold, and place some dark. I think by placing that dark in the lower left, and of course if something looks like it's floating, it's mainly because what you need to do is equalize the value. So what I need to also do is make it darker underneath. And now it's starting to look like it's part of the flower. Whereas before it looked pretty floaty. This is where you can also come back, look for areas that can be made a tiny bit darker. Not creating a new dark area, but just getting a little bit darker in existing dark areas. And a little bit here. This is not necessarily this particular flower. It's not really, really shiny, but we can come back in and add a few highlights. So I'm going back to my warm white. And just like with the dark, looking for areas that can be made one value lighter and not the whole area. Just, for example, in the middle of this rolled area or this ruffled area, just coming back in the middle of that and making it a tiny bit lighter. And I'm going to place these and then blend them, but just going through section by section by section, saying, okay, this area I could probably make right there a little lighter. Okay, right there. Just looking for areas that are too large of an area to just be all one value, like in here. I'm going to wipe my brush, actually take my little tiny brush and turn it into a tiny flat. Blend these down. But not too much, because you're trying to end up with one light, bright little area. And I think with, you have to come back and just really look at this and continue working your way around, saying inch by inch, what could I do to make it better? Where could I add a shine that would enhance the form? My favorite part is that this is dry, so if you put something in and go, well, that did nothing, then how nice, you just take it out because it is dry. Underneath, that is. You can go back and work on the leaves a little bit more also, but don't do too much to the leaves or the branch, because I really like how this, on mine at least, how this is coming, and it's definitely the star attraction. And if you do, it's like if you emphasize everything, you've emphasized nothing. Probably the only thing that you really need to do on your cherries, and I only did one, is add a little bit of a high shine. Cherries are quite shiny, and then that will tell the viewer, especially because they're dark and barely there, that there is something there worth looking at. And maybe a little bit of blue reflected light. So I think we've done what we can with poppies and cherries in an hour. Your job is to paint the poppies, all of the cherries, all the leaves, and get ready for our next project.